Okay, fantastic. As I said, very good morning to one and all. Great to have you all with us this morning as we pick up where we left off last session. So if you recall, we looked at different perspectives and leadership styles. Last week, we built on the idea of contingency models of leadership. We then moved into transformational leadership before finally looking at some of the more social aspects, including Hersey-Blanchard's model. We looked further into servant leadership. We looked at silent leadership, and we looked at other forms of quiet leadership before we moved into considering executive pay. So looking at leadership in general, there are a number of different perspectives that can be used to explain or to try and map how leadership is brought to the fore. Strategic leadership itself sits, as I've said already, within the corporate layer or the executive layer of leadership. So you're very much thinking about the CEO level, you're talking about boardroom, you're talking about chief strategy officers, you're talking about chief marketing officers. These are all people that are seen to have or hold a leadership position. Now, if you remember correctly, I also said in the very first session that leadership, in terms of the traits, in terms of characteristics, they can be observed essentially in different places of an organization. You can be a leader on the shop floor if you can motivate and inspire people around you. You can be a leader in a lower management position, leader in a middle management position. So leadership itself can be observed anywhere, but for the purposes of this module, our focus has been on strategic leadership, which essentially lies in the upper echelons. So very much looking at boardroom level, looking at those senior directors who hold those leadership roles. So part of strategic leadership and senior leadership, one of the current debates in the literature lies around how socially responsible these leaders are. So if you remember at the tail end of last week's lesson, we were looking at executive pay and considering whether or not whether that reflects the level of responsibility or whether it is unsustainable and leaders are perhaps exploiting the organizations that they work for. So some perspectives that emerge from the existing literature at the moment and the focus around executive pay, there's a couple of different perspectives I want to discuss this morning. So firstly, can leaders be socially responsible without the approval and support of their shareholders? So again, it's looking at the motivations and the drivers for leadership. What drives them to go to work every day? What is it that gets them out of their bed and makes them think, yes, today we're going to make a difference? Now, social responsibility is nothing new. CSR has been around for a very, very long time. But over recent years, it started to take more impetus. No longer is CSR seen as a nice to have. It is seen as something that is compulsory, something that every organisation should have a consideration for and should be working towards. Profit motivations obviously would lie primarily within the remit of the organisation, but profit motivations alone are not enough. Consumers increasingly, and the general public, even if you're not a consumer of a certain company, you still want to see them behaving ethically, morally. You want to see them doing good for society. So organisations now are more in the limelight than ever before when it comes to social responsibility. So the question I ask is, can leaders be socially responsible without the approval and support of their shareholders? Now, shareholder primary motivators tend to be around profit and financial performance. So how socially responsible can a leadership team be when they know that they are at the mercy of shareholders who can vote them out of their positions? Secondly, do you in fact need your shareholders to be socially responsible first? So again, thinking about what is the role of leadership, and do you actually need shareholders to be socially responsible before leadership themselves can assume that position? A number of different areas I want you to think about here. The fact that best leaders are expensive. Is it possible to be responsible around executive pay if you're seeking the best leaders? So again, similar to any craft, similar to any art in the world, if you want to hire the best or the most skilled or the most experienced people into a leadership position in your organization, then you would expect to be paying a premium. You would expect to be paying for those skills, those experiences, those expertise that may or may not otherwise be available in other less experienced leaders. So again, the function of executive pay can reflect the different skill levels, different pay grades, different perspectives that leadership can bring. So again, thinking about that, is executive pay grossly inflated, or does it reflect the arts and craft of that profession. We also want to consider, is the concept inherent or is it driven by external stakeholders, e.g. pressure groups, etc., etc. So here we're looking more specifically at social responsibleness. So is social responsibility something that's inherent in an organisation today and something that should be taken into consideration, or is it driven by external stakeholders such as lobby groups, pressure groups, climate change activists, even the United Nations to an extent, that are driving a large part of the social responsibility of corporations by considering things like sustainability development goals and the SDGs that were developed in 2015. So again, other bodies, other public and international bodies have a role to play in driving sustainability and driving social responsibility in organizations. Also consider whether it's responsive. If it is responsive, is it authentic? And if it's not authentic, is there such a thing as being a socially responsible leader? So are leadership now just responding to the pressures of the environment, or do they truly want to be socially responsible? And if they are being responsive, is it authentic? Is it something they actually aspire to be and do? Do they aspire to do good for the world? Do they actually want to make a difference? Or are they just following the crowd? Okay, so if they're not being authentic, could you really argue that there is such a thing as being a socially responsible leader? So again, something for you to consider. You know, social responsible leadership really emerged as a concept over the recent decade, probably late 2000s. Thinking about, you know, why organizations, some of them are better at CSR, are better at social responsibility than others. And one of the perspectives that emerged was leaders in those roles were, you know, more inclined towards social leadership or socially responsible leadership. So the question that was posed was, well, if it's not authentic and all leaders are doing is just considering the external environment and responding perhaps to pressures, is it really that they are a socially responsible leader, or are they just doing what they need to do to continue in the job? So that's something to consider, particularly for those of you that are writing about leadership in your assignment and thinking about the role of leadership when it comes to different organisational practices and organisational elements. And finally, there is a reform that's being driven by the ICAEW. Now, I will explain to you who they are in national government, but this is very much a UK-based perspective. But let's just quickly cover who they are. So in 2018, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales published proposals for reforms called Connect and Reflect. Now, there is a link that I've provided in the slides. I'm not going to go into it because it's quite a heavy report. It's a PDF report that you can download, and it discusses the findings, and it discusses some of the proposals made by this group. But basically, the ICAEW admits that the proposals that they're making are quite ambitious, but they sense that there is a willingness in companies to change. It seems to be that organizations are wanting to do the right thing. They're wanting to be seen to be socially responsible. So ICAEW makes a number of proposals that outline why and how organizations should be changing and how they should reflect on their role in society, in terms of making sure they're delivering on the sustainability goals, they're showing moral and ethical responsibility, and they are doing right by the communities who they serve and work with on a regular basis. Okay. But what does that really mean for what we're looking at? So we're looking at executive pay here. What does that really mean? So it comes back to the question I asked last week. Executive pay, is the problem apparent or is it real? So what I want to think about here is executive remuneration, the salary, is it reflective of the industry in which they operate and the expertise and skills that they've garnered to get into those positions, or is it grossly inflated? Some additional perspectives beyond what I discussed with you last week. Cecil and Carroll, in their 1980 publication, discussed the level of executive compensation being determined by market forces. So similar to what I was saying at the very beginning of today's lecture, market forces such as supply and demand of people in that position, people with that level of expertise, experience, knowledge, skill. There is a consistent pattern that implies that the base salary received by executives is determined by the interaction of supply and demand. So leadership research carried out by Cecil and Carroll from an economic angle, discovered that a lot of executive pay, was being determined by that interaction of supply and demand. Elements where supply was low and organizations were demanding leadership positions, they were able to charge a premium, because at the end of the day, when supply is low, people will pay extra to secure. Similarly, where in cases of oversupply and lack of jobs, that will drive down prices, but that's not something that's been observed in their findings. Their findings suggested that supply and demand only applied on a one-way basis, that when supply was low, demand was driven up. However, there was no such thing as excess supply, implying that there was actually a shortage of people qualified or people demonstrating that they contained the requisite experience, the requisite skills to hold leadership positions. But if we bring Cecil and Carol's views into the 21st century and we focus on what we've observed, so if we think about 2008, 2009 economic crisis position and what happened with the banking crisis and when the bubble burst in the housing market, the views were still mixed. Leadership pay and executive pay wasn't something that was universally popular. In fact, the media were lambasting these organizations for paying exuberant amounts of money to their shareholder, to their executive board, and also some organizations were paying a dividend when the rest of the world was facing this uncertain future. It's fair to say that even today, more than a decade on, the position is still mixed, but we are tending towards skeptical. People are beginning to become more skeptical about how much these organizations are paying their executive leadership team. So again, bearing in mind executive pay, could we argue that leaders really represent social responsible leadership when they're not actually considering how society views them, how society understands, or in any way, shape or form sympathizes with their position? So something for you to consider, okay, when you do decide to focus on this element of leadership, and what is socially responsible leadership, and how does executive pay perhaps mitigate some of the success or some of the achievements of leaders when it comes to CSR and other sustainability-led practices. So that concludes the lesson from last week. We had a couple of slides left which I wanted to cover with you. So let me just stop the share there and we can move on to the next slide deck. The screen again. So continuing what we're looking at in the previous session and early this morning, we're now going to focus our attention on what is executive power in leadership and how does that influence governance performance. So remember, one of the functions of executive leaderships is to provide governance in an organization. They're responsible for ensuring that an organization obeys the rules, the laws, the practices, and also to develop an internal structure for governance. How do they control people in the organization? So governance is a function that is almost exclusively reserved for leadership. They set the direction. Management then become responsible for controlling it. It's their role to ensure people are complying, but executive leadership and executive power is what determines what governance will look like. So leadership very much belongs to that domain. So first and foremost, leadership teams need power, okay? So you remember from what we discussed that executive leadership, or the executive leadership team, they set the strategic goals for an organization and they communicate these to management. So remember, leadership are responsible for setting the direction. They're responsible for establishing what the organization is going to do. They set that strategic goal, the strategic direction, and management are then responsible for overseeing that. Management will then implement those goals, and they will then also monitor performance. They will monitor how well employees are performing. Okay, so the executive function of management is to do with implementation and also systems function, which is monitoring. Whereas executive leadership themselves are more responsible for generating and communicating that down. So the key question that I want you to consider in this next series that we look at this morning is, how does a leadership team acquire and use its power? Okay, so if we think about the executive leadership function and we think about the position they hold in an organization, How do they acquire that power? Is it just bestowed upon them because of their role in the organization? Or is it something that they acquire through building goodwill, through building a kind of a reputation, building a stronghold within their followers? Or is it something, as I said, that they just gain when they enter the executive leadership role? After all, we know that leadership needs power in order to direct management, to tell management what to do, and to facilitate management doing their job. Leadership positions and leadership roles require a certain degree of power. So before we go any further, how can we perhaps define power? Because power can mean a lot of different things. And I'm sure when I said, executive leadership need power, a number of you on the call probably thought of that in different ways. You probably thought of that from different angles, different perspectives. So when we look at the concept of power, there are two key perspectives that I want you to consider. Now, both of these come from common derivatives or common themes. Number one, the perspective we're going to look at is from Buchanan and Husinski, 2004 publication. And then we're going to look at Peffer, 1992. Now, Peffer's publications are actually more prominent. Peffer's seen as quite a leading writer in the field. However, Buchanan and Husinski's work perhaps arguably more reflective of 21st century society. So let's look into what they said and what they defined as leadership. So perspective one comes from Buchanan and Husinski. Now they say that power is the capacity of individuals to overcome resistance on the part of others, to exert their will and to produce results consistent with their interests and objectives. Now again, quite a loaded definition that we have in front of us, and perhaps not the easiest to follow or understand, but really what we're saying here is that power rests in the capacity of individuals. Okay, so those individuals being executive leadership in our context, to overcome resistance. So what kind of resistance are we talking about here? We're talking about the people in the workforce. We're talking about management. We're talking about employees, and sometimes even stakeholders that may be outside of the organizational scope, such as customers, suppliers, etc. Now, they might be resistant to change. They may be resistant to perhaps the perspectives or the approach taken by that leadership individual or that leadership team. So to overcome that resistance is quite important on the part of others. So again, it's not just about resistance in individuals, it's resistance collectively. And then once they've overcome that resistance, to exert their will. So it's about being able to demonstrate or being able to apply what they know, what they learn, and how their expertise stands them in good stead. Okay, so it's about exerting their position. It's about showing that they are there to lead, they are there to control, and to produce results consistent with their interests and objectives. So the final bit is probably the most important. Leadership will be able to grow their power, will be able to abstain from losing that power if they produce results that demonstrate the objectives and the interests that they claim to pursue. Okay, if a leadership function isn't performing, if it isn't achieving certain results, then the fellowship will never ever believe that they ever held power. They will start to test that power. They will start to challenge that power. They will start to resist what leadership say and do. So in order to continue exerting their will, in order to continue exerting their power, they need to produce results that are consistent with the interests and objectives that they've set. So that's Buchanan and Husinski. But if we move now on to Peffer's definition is slightly different. Peffer argues that power is the potential ability to influence behaviour. So again, if we look at change in words, it's about the influence on people's behaviour. It's not necessarily about exerting themselves. It's about influencing people to change the course of events. So again, change is quite important here. Again, thinking about how do you influence people to be able to do things differently? How do you influence people to buy into a change management program? Resistance comes up here again. So to overcome resistance. So again, it's something that's consistent in the literature that employees naturally, our default position as an employee at any level in the organization is to want to resist something that's different, resist something that's new, mostly because we're scared. We don't know how that new thing is going to impact us. We don't know what the changes on our job profile are going to be. So our natural default position is to find faults or find issues with a change. So they need to, once they've influenced people, need to overcome any due resistance. And then they have to get people to do things that they would not otherwise do. Now that's quite an open and broad, ambiguous last sentence, but what we're saying here is people wouldn't actively do things differently. When you go to work, when you're an employee for any organization, as I'm sure most of you have had some experience, you get into routines, you start to develop best practice, you start to work in certain ways, certain behaviors, certain functions and roles that you perform. When someone asks you to change them, that can be quite daunting. That can be quite a difficult experience because you've developed those kind of coercive experiences that you perform on a regular basis. So when someone's asking you to change that, it can be quite difficult. So that's where the resistance can come in. That's when you need someone to influence you. And according to Peffer, that is the role of leadership. And that's what power is. Power is that ability to be able to influence and overcome those resistance in order to achieve what employees otherwise would not participatorily want to do. Okay, you wouldn't voluntarily want to do something in that way without perhaps that influence. So those are two perspectives I want to keep in mind for power if you are looking to address the influence of leadership through power. You know, what is the definition of power and how does it impact people? Then we look at, well, where does power actually lie? I mean, we talked about executive leadership needing power, but where does it come about? How does it come about? So the common themes that you find in literature are that power lies in latent structures. Okay, so it's latent in the structures. It's not something that's always exercised. So what we're saying there is, it's looking at that old hierarchy perspective. Because you assumed a certain position in that hierarchy, you are expected to hold a certain degree of power. Okay, so power lies in structure, not necessarily an individual trait. Yes, some people are more forceful, more aggressive, more powerful in terms of characteristics and demeanor, but that doesn't always mean that they have power. You could be the most forceful person in the world, but may only be a shop floor employee. And the person in a leadership position might be quite a timid person, but he or she holds power because of where they sit in the organizational structure, okay? So power is latent in the structure. Power lies dormant in rules, resources, relations, positions, and practices. Now, this is quite interesting. What we're arguing here is that power does also exist in the ways in which we configure the workplace, the way in which resources are organized and deployed, the way in which relationships exist within an organization, and also within the positions and practices held by individuals. Now, someone in a lower management or a supervisory role may assume that they have power over their team. Now, to a certain degree, that might be true, but it's all about that dormant power, okay? So that power doesn't allow them to do whatever they want. Yes, they might have a perceived sense of power, but whether or not that power allows them to actually make changes relevant to their team and change the direction taken by their team is open to discussion, because at the end of the day, they have to observe the rules of the organization. They still have to follow the structure set by senior management and the structure established by executive leadership. So power can be seen as being latent in structure, but dormant in rules, resources, relations, positions, and practices. So in other words, how can we understand that? Well, power lies in many places, and leadership are in a fortunate position to access. So they can access it through the structure. They hold a hierarchical position, quite senior in the organization. So they've got access to that degree of power because of their position, but also because they can then apply rules. They can then make decisions as to what resources to pull, what resources to implement. So again, they've got power in that perspective. They can establish relationships within certain functions. They can create links, they can destroy links, they can remove functions. So relations are quite important source of power. Positions, again, leadership may decide to remove certain layers of management. They may decide that certain positions deserve more importance because they carry out a more value add or a more value specific task. And finally, the practices, leadership may decide that they want to change the way in which things are done. They may want to get management to implement new ways of working. So again, power can lie in the practices and the ways in which work is carried out. In order to understand how power operates, I like to think of it like putting your computer in sleep mode. Okay, so when you put your computer in sleep mode, it essentially is powered down. Okay, it's not using the same amount of processing power. The CPU unit's quiet, but it's ready to be activated by the user. So as soon as you press the enter key, or you click on the on the mouse or something, the computer fires up. You hear it firing up. You can hear the CPU starting to run. Well, that's basically what power is. Power is there. It's always there. It's just that leadership or executive leadership will choose. They'll be smart about when they want to access it. They won't want to be seen as constantly exerting power, constantly trying to influence people, constantly trying to tell people what to do, because that can be difficult. That can be a difficult position to sustain. People will automatically start resenting you. So again, power is something that's there, but it's not always demonstrated or applied. It's something that is only used sparingly by leadership or executive leadership, as and when they decide that this is a time to make changes. Okay, so it's ready to be activated by the user, which tends to be the executive leader in the context that we're exploring strategic leadership from. So that's how we can understand power in those structures. What about access to the sources of power? So here what we're saying is there are two key categories of a leader's access to power. Number one is corporate access. So by corporate access, we mean the formal positions and the authority held within an organization. So this comes back to the hierarchy perspective, okay? Depending on where a leader is, which in our context is always senior leadership because we're looking at strategic leadership, that formal position held gives a person authority. It gives a person the right to be able to make certain changes, to be able to exert their influence in certain ways. Access and control to information. Now, this is very, very important. The last thing leadership want to do is to be put in a position where they've made a poorly informed decision. So what you tend to find is decisions are only implemented or only ever given the go-ahead once people in leadership positions have had access to a full array of information. They are fully informed as to the decision they're making. They won't make that decision without having access to the material, without having conducted their research, without having built up that bank of knowledge. Okay, so access and control to information is critical. The centrality of department in the business. So again, how central the department is in the business. Certain functions are more critical to business activity than other functions. I'll give you a good example of that. So if we think about the role of HR, so HR can be fundamental because it extends the whole length of the business. It looks at, human resources practices throughout different areas of the business. So you could argue HR could be quite central because human resources will be a team that you probably want to engage with when you want to influence your workers, when you want to change their behaviour, when you want to change the way they work. So HR can be seen as being quite central to the business function or the business activity, but other departments might not be seen as being as value add. So what might they be? So for example, you may argue that functions such as marketing aren't important when you're trying to implement an internal change. Okay, so when it comes to internal changes, marketing might not be someone you want to engage with because they're not central to that decision. They don't need to know about, well, maybe they need to know about it, but they don't need to influence anyone. You don't need their support to be able to deliver the change. So again, centrality of department is constantly evolving. You can't argue that at any one point that one department is more central than others. That's not true. All departments evolve depending on the context of a change. Similarly, if you're implementing a new financial system or a new financial management system, automatically your finance team becomes the most central. It's all about thinking, what it is you're looking to do. So centrality is quite important when it comes to power. The role in solving critical problems. So again, with corporate access, the idea is that the problems that you're solving or the problems that you're tackling, executive leadership will be seen to be taking a senior role. They'll be seen to be involved. They'll be seen to be someone that, or people that are fully engaged and involved in that process. Two reasons for that. Number one, if you are making a change in an organization, people need accountability. They want to hold someone accountable for that change, and that tends to fall, the burden tends to fall on leadership. Okay, so even though leadership may have only set the direction, and there might be other people involved in implementing it. The workforce or the general population of the organization will want to hold someone accountable for that change. Who is it that is accountable for delivering, or who is it response? Who is it accountable for bringing this change in? So that's number one, the role in solving critical problems. Number two, for a leadership role, for a leadership function, to be able to justify its position, they want to be involved in that change. They want to be seen as being contributing to that change. They want to be seen as being actively involved in the organization. So there's two perspectives by which we can understand that corporate access to power. And then finally, the perception of being irreplaceable. Now, this is an interesting one and something that probably hasn't had as much recognition or as much research conducted as perhaps it should have. One of the ways in which leadership power is understood at a corporate layer is that concept of being irreplaceable. And in the sense that once you're in that position, you probably are one of the most powerful people in the organization. You know, the way in which you can influence and change what is going on, there's limited few people that can stop that from happening. So the concept that you sometimes need to have that perception of being irreplaceable, you know, nobody can tell you what to do perspective, that can be quite powerful, and that can be a source of power for people. It can empower executive leaders, sometimes negatively. We've seen poor examples of perhaps unethical behavior by leadership because of that perspective, whereby they see themselves as being irreplaceable. They see themselves as being the proverbial top dog that nobody can replace them. Okay, so that's the corporate perspective. Let's now move on to the personal access perspective. So looking at it from a personal access type of angle, energy, endurance, and physical stamina. So this comes down to the persona of the leader. How energetic and how involved and active are they in the organization? You know, are they a quiet or servant leader and they sit in the background, and you know that you don't hear from them, you don't see them being involved? Or are they perhaps someone that's very transformational, very authentic, wears their heart on their sleeve? They want to be involved, they want to be seen as being making a difference in the organization. So energy, endurance, and physical stamina are quite important. Okay, how energetic is the person? How involved are they? How willing are they to perhaps, you know, be seen, be vocal, be visible? Their ability to focus energy and avoid wasteful effort. Now, again, you'd argue that people in leadership positions shouldn't be wasting time or wasting resource, but unfortunately, what we tend to find is because of perhaps the importance of being able to access and be able to utilize information, sometimes leadership will wait longer than they should. Sometimes they will waste time because they want to make sure they've gathered as much information as possible. You know, if you've got 95% of the information and it indicates that you should be doing something, do you really need to wait for that final 5%? That's something that you can maybe argue in terms of your perspective on that. But really, sometimes leadership want to be able to demonstrate that, you know, they are making timely decisions, they are focusing their energy and resource, and they're not being wasteful in their efforts. So that's something that comes more from a personal access angle. The sensitivity and ability to read and understand others. This comes back to emotional intelligence. Now, we touched on emotional intelligence and EQ in the last lecture series when we were talking about different traits and characteristics. But the ability of a leader to be able to read their people, to be able to understand what people are feeling and thinking, that can be quite powerful, because people like that tend to be, they tend to hold like a transformational style of leadership. You know, they're able to read people's emotions, they're able to sympathize, they're able to relate to people. Those types of leaders automatically build a lot of sympathy in their followership. They build goodwill in their followership. The flexibility in selecting varied means to achieve goals. So again, what you don't want in an organizational perspective, especially from an executive leadership role, is someone that's fixated on one way of doing things. Unfortunately, as we've observed with society, as we've observed with the economic landscape, it's constantly evolving. What was best practice 10 years ago is now seen as being obsolete. It's now seen as being something you don't ever want to be seen doing, because, you know, it's no longer effective, it's no longer efficient, it's no longer the way in which things are done. So leadership in a particular, in the same guise, needs to ensure that they're evolving. The way in which decisions are implemented, the way in which decisions are communicated, the way in which decisions are even formed can evolve. There's different practices for doing that. If anyone attends my strategic management class, I've covered a lot of different perspectives on the different horizons and how organizational strategic management can be understood using different models, different theories. The only reason there are so many models and theories is because leadership and the function of strategic leadership or strategic management is constantly evolving. It's never static. Okay. Yes, certain theories continue to be applied from the past. Certain theories hold sway and hold prominence, but constantly we're seeing an evolution in the way in which leadership and management from a strategic guise is brought to life. Okay, so they need to demonstrate flexibility. They need to be able to understand that they need to reflect the needs of their organization. They need to reflect the economic landscape. They need to reflect on what society wants as part of their approach. Personal toughness and a willingness to engage in conflict and confrontation. In a leadership role, that's always going to exist, partly down to the media culture. Media will want to scrutinize everything a leader does. They'll want to create a narrative whereby the leader is failing, or the leader is not performing as well as they should, or the leader is not doing something, you know. Similarly, they'll create a positive angle as well. You know, there's certain leaders that are looked upon favorably. So having a thick skin, having an ability to ride out the storm is quite critical from a personal angle. Okay, so to maintain power and to be seen as someone who deserves that power, you need to have that thick skin. Your ability to enlist support of others. Again, this is your ability to gain buy-in, basically. How well can you influence people? How well can you get people on your side? And finally, the pervasiveness of one's action. Again, if you're in a leadership position and you're trying to implement a change that isn't popular, how pervasive are you in trying to do that? You know, are you going to try once or twice and then give up, or are you someone that's going to persevere? Are you going to, you know, be pervasive and you're going to follow through on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve? Okay. So there's a few perspectives in terms of how power can be accessed from a corporate perspective, in terms of their role in the organization, and then from a personal perspective in terms of characteristics, traits, and behaviors. So continuing on from what we've just discussed there, some well-known tactics that are used by leaders to access that power, these coming straight from the literature. Number one, cultivating an image. So creating an image of, you know, what they're looking to achieve, creating an image of how that's going to impact the people. That's quite powerful. Being able to see what the change will look like can be quite a powerful tool, and it can be quite useful to influence people or change their behavior. If people can see what management is looking for them to achieve, then they'll be able to buy into it a lot better. Being selective with disseminating information. Now, this may feel like, okay, what's going on here? Are leadership intentionally withholding information? Are they intentionally, you know, only choosing facts and figures that suit the narrative? Well, the answer to that is almost yes. I mean, they'll have considered all the pros and cons. They've done a lot of research. They've accessed a lot of information, but they will be selective with what they share. Because if you're trying to get people to buy into something, if you're trying to get people on your side, you can't really lead with a negative. You will always want to share the positives, the pros. So what you will find is leadership will be very, very selective with what information they share, both within the organization and also external to the organization. And that's very, very true when it comes to sharing, you know, high-level details about the company. We all know that we can access high-level missions, objectives, but can we really access the strategy that an organization is following from their corporate website? Not really. All we can do is we can observe what they've done in the past and make a guess as to how they might approach the future. But no self-respecting company, no self-respecting leadership position or role. So you won't ever see the chief strategy officer or the chief executive officer come out and say, here is our strategy, here is how we're achieving it, here's what our focus is for the next year, here's our goals and objectives. They won't really do that. They'll set a general sense of strategy. They'll come out and they'll tell the public or they'll tell the media, especially when you're a new CEO and you're trying to make your changes. or stamp your authority. You might come out and say, here's my focus. I'm going to lead this organization to becoming more people focused. That's not really a strategy. That's just an angle or a lens through which you're going to change the organization. The actual strategy is something they'll never share with you. Okay. So being selective with disseminating information is one of the kind of ways in which they hold and demonstrate their power. Number 3, engaging in scapegoating others. Now, this again may not sound like the most ethical practice in the world, but they will try to hide behind others. Now, that again can sound quite bad because you would expect leadership to be transparent, to be accountable, but when things are, or if they do start to go wrong, they will try to find ways to pin that blame on somewhere else in the organization. They will always try and scapegoat because at the end of the day, they risk losing everything. They risk losing their position. So again, that can be a source of power, the ability to hide behind other people and put other people in the limelight when maybe things are not going your way. Just demonstrates the power that leadership can hold. Forming strategic alliances. Now, these can be external as well. So this is looking about how leadership can look to influence their organization. They can look to change the trajectory of their organization by forming strategic alliances, both internal and external to the organization. Assiduously networking. Now, some of you might be thinking, what does he mean by assiduously? Well, basically always or constantly networking, okay? So always being in a position where they're building that network, they're building their access to new information, they're building their reserve banks so that they can maybe bring in expertise from elsewhere. Networking is a fundamental component of leadership. If you observe, or even if you watch some of these documentaries on Netflix, you watch these series on Netflix where they're based on companies that are based on large corporations, you often see these events that are being held on almost a daily basis. And that's a fundamental part of leadership. They need to attend these events. They need to be showing face, not only to demonstrate their position, but also to be able to access certain levels of information, detail, the certain discussions that are had during those networking events that can lead to major changes in an organization. Number 6, being pragmatic and compromising. So again, when they do need to compromise, they tend to be quite pragmatic in doing that. Okay, they tend to have structure to the compromise. The last thing a leader wants is to be held over a barrel, because that just shows they don't have any power. So they have to be quite pragmatic in their approach. They want to be seen to be holding power even when they are having to compromise. So the pragmatic perspective is something that is quite critical to having or demonstrating their access to sources of power. And finally, number 7, being willing to manipulate the rules. So again, this may be seen as a negative trait of leadership, but showing a willingness or being in the limelight to be seen as being manipulative is something that's needed to demonstrate that power. Sometimes you need to manipulate the rules in order to make them suit your narrative. If you're trying to make changes, if you're trying to achieve something different in your organization, the existing rules can be cumbersome. The existing rules, processes can stop you sometimes in your tracks or try and prevent you from passing. So sometimes leaders do need to manipulate those rules. Okay, so these are just some of the examples in the literature. I'm sure there's plenty more. So these might be a basis for you to start from if anyone's looking at executive leadership and the role of power. These are some of the areas how leadership power can be exerted or demonstrated. What about exercising that power? So in 1975, the German-American sociologist Amita Etzoni wrote his theory of compliance. Now, this theory identifies 3 power involvement couplings. Okay, so this is where they describe how a leader might exercise his or her power, the effect that has on those subject to it, and these 3 are coercive power, utilitarian power, and normative power. Now, again, quite loaded terms or concepts, so we're going to look at them in detail on the next couple of slides. So coercive power is essentially where leaders use force and fear to control people. Now, increasingly, this is becoming more of an obsolete form of leadership, or more frowned upon form of leadership, because the last thing you want as someone in a leadership position is to come out in the media and be seen as being, someone that's exerting fear or exerting force, but it still does exist. Organizational leaders sometimes will issue ultimatums, change or do things differently, otherwise you're out the door type thing. So again, leadership has that power. They can control the narrative, they can control what's acceptable and not acceptable in an organization. So force and fear can be quite strong. If you're a shop floor employee earning, a nice enough salary to support your family, you've got young kids in the house, do you really want to stand up to someone in a leadership position and risk your job, or will you just observe what they're saying, accept, back down? So again, force and fear is something that coercive power is seen as being critical in leadership roles. Okay. Examples of organizations that often rely on coercive power: places like prison facilities. Okay, so prisoners are assumed to be feared, or they're scared of the consequences of standing up to senior prison officers. They can be punished if they don't accept their fate, if they don't accept their place in the prison. The military. So again, we see this on a daily basis. If anyone's watched any military series, or they've watched any of the kind of documentaries done on the military, you'll see that rank and order are very, very critical in how the military operates. So power can be demonstrated through that coercive lens, because lower level cadets will feed into that fear. They'll be taught to learn to respect senior ranks. They'll be taught to learn to bow down almost to the demands of senior ranking officers, senior ranking people in the military. Okay, so coercive power is the number one perspective that we observe. Number two, we look at utilitarian power. So utilitarian power is where leaders are using remuneration and rewards to control people. So what do we mean by that? It's about almost trying to influence people with rewards. These can include salary. So, salary increase if you accept this new position, which is a changed job profile, or, salary increase if you, accept this change and now have a different role to profile to perform. Bonuses, again, if you achieve this, we will give you an extra 10% bonus this year. So again, it's all about getting people on your side by offering the financial rewards, by offering other benefits that they may not otherwise have been subject to. Fringe benefits. So increasingly, workers, employees, it's not just about the salary package, it's about the other benefits that are available. It's about the working conditions, it's about access to stuff like private healthcare, access to stuff like dental care, gyms, that kind of stuff. So fringe benefits are being seen as being increasingly important. Good working conditions. Now, sometimes it is simple as improving the working conditions. If you're working in a dark, damp, stingy factory, then if someone in a leadership position wants you to change, or wants you to take on new positions or take on new roles, then one of the ways in which they might get you on board is by changing your working conditions. They may improve the conditions in which you work. They may buy you new machinery. They may, make the surrounding environment cleaner, nicer, tidier. Again, that can influence someone. So utilitarian power is all about providing utilities to people to try and get them on side. Most businesses will use these types of rewards. I'm sure when you go to apply for a job and it talks about benefits and salaries, you tend to find a lot of information, a lot of detail talking about the benefits. Salary tends to be one line. This is the salary package. Then they move on from it very quickly and they focus on the extra benefits. The idea is it's utilitarian power. They want to be able to influence you based on those extra benefits, those extra things that they provide in that organization. Okay, so that's utilitarian power. Finally, normative power. Now, normative power is where leaders use the allocation of symbolic rewards or esteem symbols to control people. So what do we mean by that? That's usually by getting people to, or stimulating people's intellectual abilities. Okay, so if you're an organization that does relatively repetitive or mundane work, it's all about perhaps working on a production line, working on the manufacturing side of a business or something along those lines, then it can be quite repetitive, constantly same thing over and over again. So by giving a worker a piece of interesting work to do, you're automatically getting them on board, getting them on side, because they'll want to do something different. They want to do something more interesting, something that's not their everyday job. So that can be a different way of demonstrating your power. Giving a worker a smartphone or a car parking space, again, some people argue part of the benefits, but if you're trying to get someone on side, or you're trying to exert your power, you're trying to show them that you can provide them with certain things that if they come on board with your way of thinking, then again you can exert your power. So by providing them with a company phone, providing them with a dedicated car parking space, it's a way of demonstrating normative power. I can do this for you if you buy into what we're doing. And finally, administrating rituals. So for example, perhaps hosting staff lunches. Sometimes you see organizational leaders, maybe every quarter or every year, they'll have a staff specific lunch where the leaders of the business will come down and they'll sit with the staff and they will spend time talking to the people. Now, again, some people argue, well, they're doing a good thing, but it's part of the normative power, and they want to show them that we are here, we are there to do things for you, and we can reward you if you buy into what we're trying to achieve. Okay, so these rituals can be seen as a form of trying to influence and coerce people into following what they're doing. Okay. So in this case, power rests on the leader's ability to be able to manipulate that symbolic reward. Now, a leader coming down and having lunch with its people or with their people isn't necessarily a way of manipulating or influencing, but if that leader is looking to then achieve a certain change, or they're trying to do things differently in the organization that might cause some kickback, they'll want to be seen as being on the shop floor, listening to the staff. They want to be seen as being sympathetic to their cause. So they may well do like a special dinner or lunch to show them that they care about them. So again, it can be quite manipulative, the use of these symbolic rewards. Influencing the distribution of acceptance. So again, sometimes people don't necessarily want to accept these benefits or want to accept these symbolic rewards, but they're almost pressurized or forced into doing it because maybe their peers are doing it. Maybe it's seen as being offensive to reject, or seen as being what's the word I'm looking for here? I've lost the word, sorry. Seeing as be almost rejecting a kind gesture from someone senior. Now, how kind that gesture is depends on what the leader's looking for in return. Many professional people work in normative type of organizations. So a lot of the professional fields, such as knowledge-intensive industries, consulting, or perhaps people like doctors, nurses, people that are in kind of very knowledge-intensive based careers, knowledge-intensive based roles, they tend to be subject to normative power. Okay, people senior in their organization will tend to try and to engage with them using normative power. Now, the reason there's these three perspectives is because, can you imagine trying to use coercive power on someone that's very educated, someone that's in a knowledge-intensive role, where they are essentially the service, in a knowledge-intensive industry, people are the resource that provides you that value. So if you imagine trying to coerce them, that's not going to work. They're just going to leave and work for someone else. So you can't use coercive power. Using utilitarian power, again, that might not work because in a knowledge-intensive industry, people tend to be paid better anyway. If you look at some of these role profiles, doctors, if you look at lawyers, if you look at senior consultants, these people tend to earn, some serious money. They're already on perhaps six-figure contracts. So utilitarian power doesn't really exist. What's an extra £1,000 to them? They're probably more likely to stick to their principles. Whereas normative power can be quite important. So it's all about the symbolic rewards in order to be seen as progressing, in order to be seen as someone that's being recognized for their work. Normative power can be quite useful in that case. So how does Etzoni bring that all together? So Etzoni hypothesized that people are involved in the leader's exercise of power, thus the power involvement coupling. Okay, so in order for power to be demonstrated or exerted, people need to be involved in that interaction or that dialogue. Without it, there is no power to exercise. The ability of a leader to secure compliance in respect of the exercise of power requires participant involvement. So again, in order for a leader to achieve what they're looking to achieve, if they want to secure compliance in terms of whatever power they're trying to exercise, they need people to be involved in that conversation, in that dialogue. They need people to be on board. Now, people can be placed on what's called an involvement continuum. So that basically says that, yes, you need to get everyone on board, but not everyone's important to be able to achieve what you're looking to achieve. Okay, what does that mean? It means if you can get access to people that are perhaps quite well senior in the rankings, so even within the shop floor working, you may well have someone that just joined the business last month and he or she is fairly dispensable. And you might also have someone that's been in the business for 20 years and he or she is seen as, you know, a respected figure. He or she is seen as someone that everyone else on the shop floor looks up to, goes to for help. You know, they're respected in their line of work. Having them involved is more important than having someone who just joined the business last month. So again, thinking about the involvement continuum, who is it that needs to be on board and who is it that's perhaps dispensable and perhaps you don't necessarily have to dedicate the same amount of resource and effort to exert your power on them. The involvement continuum ranges from highly negative to highly positive. So what we mean by that is people that are negative, we don't really care too much as to whether or not we get them on board. These people, if they don't want to be involved, you're happy to cut your losses, you're happy to let them leave, you're happy to let them pursue pastures new. But the highly positive ones, these are the ones that you really want to engage. These are the ones that you don't want to lose. Okay, so highly positive is quite critical. These are the ones that you want to be able to get on board, get on your side. There are three broad categories of involvement. Number one is alienative involvement. Number two is calculative involvement, and number three is moral involvement. So let's look at those three in more detail. So involvement number one, alienative. Now this is where we're characterized by an intense or negative orientation. So examples of such can be inmates in prison or enlisted personnel. So here is where perhaps we shift from alienative to moral, in the sense that in prison, if you wanted to get someone to obey, you might put them in solitary confinement. Okay, so it's all about the negative consequences of not obeying. You know, you might prevent them from having prison visits for bad behaviour. You might prevent them from going on the parole board for potential release, early release. You know, so it's all about punishing them for not being involved. So it's more of a negative orientation. It's quite an intense orientation. And over time, there's a scope to move them from alienative to more moral involvement. So it's more about trying to be in touch with the moral side as opposed to alienating them constantly. So that's a form of alienative power, quite strong, and usually observed in military or prison setting, as opposed to an organizational and business-based concept. Calculative. So this is where you're characterized by either a negative or a positive orientation, tending to be from a low intensity perspective. So here, this is stuff like where inmates in prisons who have established relationships with prison wardens. So again, certain inmates may have favorable conditions, shall we say. Now we see this again in prison documentaries or series where you see people, you know, being shown to have access to mobile phones or access to certain things that you otherwise wouldn't have access to in a prison cell. So again, you tend to find that these people are on favorable terms, shall we say, with the prison wardens, or, you know, these are the people that perhaps have extra protection from prison wardens. If we look at the workplace, it tends to be workers who enter the employment arena but are not necessarily passionate about the work. So again, they're employed, they work for this organization, but do you know what? Would they really care if their job didn't exist? They're not necessarily passionate about the work they do. They're just doing it because they're trying to earn some money. It's not necessarily their passion. It's not something that they believe in or something that they envisage as maybe a long-term career. So again, here the orientation can be either positive or negative, and the intensity is quite low. There's no real sense of urgency. There's no real sense of needing to be seen to do the right thing in those types of exertions. Okay, so that's calculative involvement. Finally, we've got moral. So moral is when we're characterizing it by positive orientation and very high intensity. So this tends to be maybe an example of a parishioner in a church or a synagogue. So again, it's all about being connected with something, obviously with the church. It's more of a religious connotation. You know, it's all about that positive relationship with God or positive relationship with, you know, a faith or a belief. A devoted member of a political party, now they might have a particular stance on policy, they might have a particular stance on how they're going to make a difference in society. So again, it's all about that positive orientation. Vote for me, or, you know, elect me as your member of parliament, I will do this for you. It's all about building that positive feeling, positive energy. So the devoted member of a political party would be a good example of positive or high intensity orientation. And finally, a worker who is strongly passionate about his or her work, so much so that they see it as a calling. Again, there are certain individuals that just love what they do. They buy into their job. You know, the job becomes a part of them. They do it for 30, 40, 50 years. They don't necessarily care about getting a promotion because they're already doing everything they dreamed of doing. They're doing, you know, that job. That is everything they wanted to be in life. So again, people like that, they have a very positive or high orientation, high intensity orientation. These are the ones that you want to always keep on your side. These are the ones that can help you influence others. These are the ones that can help you deliver a change, help you deliver what you're trying to achieve in an organizational context. Right, again, I've been talking for quite a long time. It's been over an hour. So let's take a quick 2-3 minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to look at corporate governance. But that's really power, okay? So we've basically wrapped up the meaning of power. We've wrapped up how power can be demonstrated, where power comes from, how you can access it, and finally, how you can exercise it as well, okay? So again, hopefully if anyone is looking to consider the role of power in executive leadership or strategic leadership as part of their assignment, there's something there for you to go on, and I've given you references as well for future or further readings, a couple of them taken from the reading that's on the module outline document as well. Okay, fantastic. Right, quick 2-3 minute break. It's now 10:06. Let's be back for 10:09, please. Okay, 10:09, and we will get going again. Thank you. Perspectives that we talked upon. Now we're going to focus on the role of corporate governance. Okay, so here is why corporate governance could be important in the context of leadership. So developing effective boards. So here's where I'm going to talk about what corporate governance is all about. And I've got a quick caricature or a cartoon to help us think about this. Perhaps it would be helpful if I go over this one more time. And as you can see, clearly the rest of the board seem to have heard this about 100 times because they're collapsing at the fear of hearing the same thing over and over again. Okay, so that's what that caricature is meant to be. Someone that's very careful, someone that's very conscious of the decision he or she's about to make and wants to ensure they've got it right. On the other hand, this one says the motion has been made and seconded that we stick our heads in the sand. So again, this is where perhaps sometimes we see leadership not taking responsibility, leadership hiding or ducking behind something. So again, the concept that effective boards can sometimes be the ones that hold each other accountable, ones that, you know, they actually push and motivate one another to be doing the right thing. So what does corporate governance mean? What we're looking at. Quick question for everyone. When you hear the phrase organizational leadership and governance, what comes to mind? I'll open this up to the room, so feel free to enter what you think in the chat or to come off mute and say what you think. So when you hear the phrase organizational leadership and governance, what comes to mind?
Do you want us to discuss it now?
Yeah, please. If you have any thoughts, please do share with me. Yes.
Well, leadership, basically, the organizational leadership is about providing control and direction for employees to achieve the objectives of the organization. So that's leadership there. And in terms of governance, we're talking about corporate governance. We're talking about looking at rules, regulations, policy directions for industry, ensuring that policies, government policies are met. So governance comes in the form of doing the right thing, ethics, code of practice, and all those things that comes to mind.
That's great, perfect. Thank you very much for those insights. I would agree with what you said there, Yasser. Thank you. Yep. So a couple of things that are also coming through the chat that some corroborate with what Yasser was saying there. The idea of discipline and consistency is all part of governance. Okay, so governance is almost there to hold leadership to account as well. What are the governance standards? What are the policies, the regulations, the ways in which business is done in this organization? That can't necessarily be manipulated or be bended. Okay, so corporate governance plays a critical role, not just at leadership level. It applies throughout the organization, but these are the rules. These are the rules of the game that even leadership can sometimes struggle to influence or change. So let's start to understand this a little bit more. So extensive research and practice in governance is based on the premise that well-performing boards coincide with well-performing organizations. Okay, so here what we're saying is boards that hold each other accountable, boards that live by the codes of practice, boards that are receptive to the idea that there is a corporate governance layer that dictates how we behave, tend to reflect well-performing organizations. Reason for that being, they infuse the types of culture, they infuse the types of behavior that are required to achieve success. Okay, so well-performing boards coincide with well-performing organizations. So what do we mean by that? So one of the kind of key things that's emerging over recent times, particularly in research, is the idea of organizational sustainability. So what is organizational sustainability? Well, the colloquial definition of sustainability is being able to keep the business going or by future-proofing the organization. So Colbert and Kruzak argue that in their 2007 publication. So it's not just about being able to be seen to do the right thing. It's about ensuring that the business is being future-proofed. It's about ensuring that you're doing the right thing today to lead the future generations of the business. It's about ensuring that you're laying the right foundations. You're following the right governance policies, procedures today, such that nobody can then come back to challenge the organization in the future based on what they did in the past. Okay. The Ford Board of Directors Sustainability Committee charter focuses on sustainable growth, which it defines as the ability to meet the needs of present customers while taking into account the needs of future generations. So this is the Ford Motor Company, so the organization that produced Ford motor vehicles. This is a statement taken from their Sustainability Committee charter, and they say that's the ability to be able to meet the needs of present customers while taking into account the needs of future generations. So again, it's about that perspective of, are we doing the right thing today? Are we developing the right culture? Are we developing the right sets of behaviors, the right ways of working, the right policies, the right procedures, such that future generations of customers, future generations of workers will be able to continue doing the job, but also be in a position whereby the precedence that's been set before them is sustainable. It's something that allows the organization to grow. It's something that won't hamper the future prospects of the organization. A couple of the key questions in organizational sustainability are around, is the organization able to maintain itself at an optimal level? Okay, so it's thinking about, are we performing to the best of our ability? Are we performing the right way that we can continue to grow, we can continue to achieve success? Can it endure the changing environment? Now, this is important, and this is something that is quite almost exclusive to leadership. And what I mean by that is, how can leadership demonstrate that they can cope with a changing environment? How can leadership demonstrate that the policies and procedures they're implementing today will allow the organization to be flexible in the face of changing circumstances, in the face of evolving social, political, economic dimensions that in the macro environment? And finally, can it influence the environment to bring about desired change? Now, this is predominantly around the internal environment. Influencing the external environment can be difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it can be difficult. In order to influence the external environment, you need to have a leadership team that either is very, very good at networking or has links in very senior places. So if your leadership team has got links into the ruling governing party of the country, or if they've got links to perhaps, you know, other industry leaders that can help influence certain things, that's the only way you can influence the external environment. Influencing the internal environment is more down to the realm of executive leadership. It's all about trying to make sure that they can influence their people to demonstrate certain changes, to change their behavior such that they can cope with changes to the external environment. Okay. So organizational sustainability is a critical role that feeds into governance, and I'm going to explain how on the next slide. So the use of governance or corporate governance, it actually dates back to the 16th or 17th century. So it's not necessarily something new, although some of the literature will make us believe that the application of it today is quite new. But it does go back, there's links to it in literature from the 1500s. So a mechanism through which boards and directors are able to direct, monitor and supervise the conduct and operation of the corporation and its management in a manner such that it ensures appropriate levels of authority, accountability, stewardship, leadership, direction and control. Okay, so corporate governance is a mechanism. So it's a set of policies, procedures, ways of working almost at an organizational entity level that can direct, monitor and supervise how people behave. It's all about making sure people are acting in line with the behavioral standards. They're acting in line with the ways in which the organization should be performing. Okay, and that is not just looking at leadership, it looks at different levels of the organization. Corporate governance isn't just for executive leadership, it's about every single person in the company ensuring that they're complying with how the organization should be behaving. And it's almost a way to curtail some of the elements of power that we discussed. How can we stop people from taking advantage or exploiting their positions of power? Well, corporate governance is a tool or a mechanism that's designed to do that. So let's look at it now from leadership perspective, because that's our focus. Okay, we're focusing on this from strategic leadership angle. So leadership for efficiency, that's to make sure that you can compete in the global economy. It's ensuring that leadership aren't just doing what's best today to turn a quick profit. They're thinking about creating an efficient, effective company, an efficient, effective machine that can continue to compete in the face of an evolving global economy. Leadership for probity. So what do we mean by that? It's all about being honest and decent, because stakeholders want to have confidence. They need to have confidence in leadership. So it's about being honest, transparent, accountable. If you're a leader that can demonstrate those traits, if you can demonstrate those behaviors, then automatically your stakeholders will buy into what you're trying to achieve, because they will see that, you know, you are someone that holds their hands up if they make a mistake. You are someone that takes ownership of what you're doing. So honesty, decency, transparency, these are all quite important to the whole level of accountability. Leadership with responsibility. So this is perhaps touching on some of the social socially responsible leadership stuff we looked at the start of the session. So to take into account the interests and needs of the broader stakeholder base. Okay, so that's leadership with responsibility. And finally, leadership that is accountable and transparent. So that feeds into what we discussed in probity. It's about ensuring that people that are in a leadership role can build trust in their organization. Okay, how do they get people to be on their side? How do they get people to believe in what they're doing? Well, it's about making sure that as a leader, you're taking ownership. You're standing up for what you believe in. And if things do go wrong or if things don't go to plan, you take ownership. Okay, you admit that perhaps the implementation didn't go to plan. You don't look for excuses. You look for ways to make changes to make it or to turn it into a success. Okay, so this is an element of how governance impacts or influences leadership. And there's a lot more I could say, but what I want you to do instead is, for the next 5 minutes, I want you to consider this following question. Now, there's maybe a little bit of research you might have to do. You might have to look on the internet. But how do leaders and leadership influence organizational performance in relation to organizational sustainability? Okay, so we talked about sustainability on the previous slide, and then we talked about corporate governance. But now thinking about leaders and their role, how do they influence organizational performance in order to achieve organizational sustainability? So if I give you 2 minutes to 3 minutes to do a bit of research, and then we can discuss for the final 2 minutes, so a 5-minute exercise, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to look into that. Once you've done some research, please just either come off mute and share with me your thoughts, or if you just type it in the chat, we can have a discussion. Okay, time starts now. Right, everyone. Hopefully, you've all had some time to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research to understand, how does leader or leadership positions influence the performance. in relation to sustainability. I've had something come through the chat, so I'm just going to share that first. If anyone else has anything they want to add, please do continue to add your perspectives to the chat, please. So Raja is saying that the employees of an organisation normally follow or look at their leaders and their behaviours and the ways in which they organise their beings to motivate or demonstrate the organisation forward. It obviously makes a direct impact by a leader's performance to sustain the organisation, as most of the employees will try to follow and copy their leaders on any occasion or any organisation. Absolutely, that's a good point. I agree with that, Raja. You're absolutely right. I think the behaviours that they demonstrate at a leadership perspective very much create the narrative for how employees or what employees deem as acceptable behaviour. Leaders determine values, culture, change, tolerance, and employee motivation. Yep, excellent, Shreya, that's good. And they shape institutional strategies, including their execution and effectiveness. Fantastic, you're absolutely right. And that all is down to doing the right thing. Okay, so organizational sustainability is quite key from that perspective. Great. And I think Yasser had raised his hand. Is there something you want to add, Yasser? Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to what my colleagues have shared, I think that employees would perform well and in a sustainable way if they feel there's trust in leadership and also role modeling of leadership, which they will copy, which one has alluded to. But also, you spoke about social aspects. We must recognize in this 21st century, employees' welfare is very, very important. So taking their welfare into consideration, listening to them and involving them at the organizational level with their views would go a long way to making them feel part of the organization, which will broaden the sustainability of the. Yeah.
Perfect. Yep, absolutely, Yasser. You made some excellent points there. So coming back to that perspective of how leadership can perhaps be seen to do the right thing themselves in order to contribute to the types of behaviour that they want to see in their organisations. It's almost like leading by example. So that's a great perspective there. And something else that Felix is saying in the chat, so leaders and leadership develop a winning organisational culture towards sustainability by setting strategic direction, engaging all employees, and creating opportunities for employees to align their goals with the strategy of the organisation. Yep, these are all good perspectives and good ways in which we can think about that. So thank you to everyone that shared their thoughts and spoke out during that session. Let's then look at what the literature says and how we can realise some of these different strategies. So what strategies have been employed most effectively? So I looked through some of the perspectives on this and I came up with the following insights. So firstly, the governance system and structure is critical. So systems and structures can provide an environment conducive to good governance practices, but at the end of the day, it depends on the acts or the omissions of the people charged with relevant responsibilities that will determine whether governance objectives are achieved. So again, what we're saying here is systems and structures are useful. Okay, so people knowing when, what to do, how to do it, what is the process that's involved. So I've given a picture here, for someone it's their time to leave the office, or for someone else they're joining, half of the board members are asleep. So again, having systems and structures is good, but it comes down to how people behave, and that's some of the perspectives that you guys raised as well in the chat, which was good to see. So the acts or omissions of the people charged with relevant responsibility will determine whether the governance objectives are actually achieved in practice. So governance systems have to support the membership. For example, the identification of the background, the skills and expertise of the people that walk into the boardroom is a good start, but it's what they actually do when they get there that is really critical. Okay. So what I mean by that is, it's good to have certain membership criteria, in order to have a fully functioning governance system or structure, you want to have certain membership criteria. But regardless of how good or how strong your membership criteria or your filtering criteria is, in order to achieve the result you want to achieve, you still have to perform when you get to that level. So governance system and structure is a good start. It tells you what are the types of behaviours you should be recruiting into your boardroom. It tells you what's the kind of structure, the systems that are needed to achieve success. but without people observing those behaviours or demonstrating those behaviours, it can be difficult to achieve success. The board composition, so touching on what I said already, we're looking here about the quality of recruitment. Most board members are appointed based on their individual status and not necessarily the skills and competencies. Now, that might be an interesting perspective for some of you, but realistically, when it comes to electing board members, a lot of companies look external to their own organisation. Internal promotion to the board isn't always as common as sometimes we think it may be. You tend to find that organisations will recruit externally. They will recruit people that have been in senior positions in other organisations. You know, for example, if you're a starter, if you're a challenger bank, for example, so if you look at fintech, you look at some of these challenger banks, they may be inclined to recruit someone that's worked in banking for the last 40 years, that maybe held a senior strategy position at Barclays or HSBC to their board, because it's easier to bring in someone that's already worked in the banking sector, that's got experience at that role, position in another organisation, than to recruit within. So sometimes it's based on individual status rather than skills and competencies within the specific organisation. The quality of board orientation and development, little is done to get them to operate as a team. Now that's interesting when you think about it, because we think about the leadership as a leadership team, but there's not really much where they actually have to work together as a team, other than when they sit around a table and have their discussions. There's no real form of getting them together, understanding how they can work together, how they can complement each other's behaviours, complement each other's skill sets. So how do their individual skills complement one another? How can we use the combination of their skills to achieve governance roles? These are all things that are open for debate. There's no one right answer. Some organisations do have team bonding activities, even at senior corporate leadership level. They have leadership away days where leadership individuals, such as the board of directors, such as senior management, will go away and they'll spend time together working on activities, working on team bonding activities to improve that teamwork behaviour, that teamwork perspective. But really it's about thinking, how do you get them to operate as one team? Because that can be critical to achieving success in the longer run. Board capacity. So what do we mean by board capacity? A great team of high caliber managers or management or leaders or experts with no or limited governance experience. So again, you could have the best team possible based on skills and expertise on how a job is done. You know, they may have worked for the organization for the last 40, 50 years of their life. You know, they've dedicated a long time, they've developed a lot of skills and expertise in how the organization works and how the organization should operate. But they might not have governance experience. They might not have actually ever held a position where they influence how governance structure should work. And that's one of the reasons why boards usually elect from external. They look for people that have corporate governance experience rather than recruiting from within and someone that's never ever understood or never ever had the opportunity to work on governance or governance perspective. And finally, the board diversity. Now, this is quite key. And over recent years, there has been a lot of improvements, but a lot of work is still required, particularly when we look at perhaps female involvement. So if you go back 25, 30 years, executive boards, if you look at the top FTSE 100 or the Fortune 500 company list, almost exclusively it was male-dominated environment. And when I say male, predominantly white, higher upper class or well-educated males from that background, okay? There's a big push in society, but also in management and business practice to try and get boards that were representative of society, boards that were representative of the organization itself. So increasingly, women have started to make up a larger component part, so female membership to the board, and also BAME groups, so looking at ethnic minorities and looking at other ethnicities and how they can play a more important role in creating a more inclusive, more diverse structure to the board, because that will reflect on the organisation. In order to build an organisation of the future, you need to be able to have the existing workforce, the existing board members, the existing team in place to reflect the composition. So that's something that's becoming increasingly important. The quality of board meetings. So the only structure legally provided for a board to deliberate and make decisions on behalf of the organisation. So again, the quality of the board meetings is important because the board meetings are the only structure that is given to that element. And what it comes down to is the quality of conversations that are had in the boardroom. So we want there to be a good quality agenda. We want them to have a focus. We want the information that's shared in these meetings to be high quality. We need to ensure that the board has a good understanding of the strategy, that they're prepared, their planning, their involvement, their appropriateness of discussion, timeliness, their passion, their trust of one another. These are all fundamental things that no one teaches you really. These are just expected to be there at that position. The common purpose and comfort within the board. So again, having a common purpose, having a certain degree of, there's an end goal, there's something we're all working towards. So that common purpose is critical. And being comfortable to challenge one another is key as well. So when you're in that board meeting, in order to ensure quality of discussion, in order to ensure that you're doing the right thing, it's about being able to challenge the thinking. It's about being able to hold each other accountable. So the cornerstone of how the board carries out the governance role, okay, the quality of the board meetings. If an organisation persists in a pattern of unproductive, listless, unclear or dreary meetings, it will soon begin to lose commitment from board members. And when you start to lose commitment, that's when your corporate governance is failing you. What about the quality of the board chair? So the board chair tends to be someone from within the group, okay? You would have someone from the leadership role, assuming that position. But the board chair plays a fundamental role. They need to be able to listen to what's going on and lead the board based on what they're observing and hearing. They've got to stick to the structure. They've got to make sure that they're giving enough time to different things they want to discuss, different things on the agenda. They need to be able to manage the meeting. Okay, so it's about ensuring that if they are having a 4-hour meeting, that in that 4-hour meeting, they cover everything on the agenda. They're not spending too long on objectives 1 and 2, such that they don't get a chance to cover objectives 3 and 4. So it's about ensuring that they manage the meeting. They're candid enough to address sensitive issues. So the board chair is quite a fundamental position because there'll be things that emerge, discussions that are had that can be sensitive in nature. They can sometimes be, uncomfortable conversations. So the board chair must be able to make sure, whilst keeping the discussion professional at all times, that they are touching on the sensitive subjects, because sometimes it's by addressing those sensitive areas, those sensitive subjects, that you can achieve the most when it comes to corporate governance. They set the tone for how the board operates. So the board chair is responsible for ensuring that people understand how to approach these discussions. They set the behaviours to be observed, to be conducted, to be carried out whilst board meetings are in progress. They ensure individual board members' accountability for personal and collective performance. And then what happens at any meeting, but particularly at board meetings, is there tends to be tasks for people to take on. There tends to be objectives that they need to deliver on. So how do they do that? Well, individual board members need to be held accountable. So the board chair will be someone that will address that. They will say, at the last meeting, person X said they would look into this thing, and then they would ask that person to stand up and share their findings. So it's all about ensuring that people are held accountable for their responsibilities. And finally, the board chair does not usurp board responsibility, okay? Just because you have a board chair doesn't mean he or she then has the final say. The responsibility is inclusive. Everyone on the board has a role to play, but the board chair is there to make sure that the way in which they approach those discussions, which can sometimes be very highly charged, highly emotive, is about ensuring that they're done in the right way. And that's important because corporate governance is about ensuring those structures, those policies, those procedures are always observed. The quality and timeliness of management reports. This is all about the information that the management get, or the leadership team gets, sorry. So what the board needs to know, not what you think the board should know. Now that's quite important, because when you're in a management position, senior management are quite close to a detail. They're responsible for making sure that they're controlling the work, they're controlling what people are doing, they're measuring and managing performance. So they have a lot of data, a lot of information, and that usually does get passed up to leadership. But the nature or the way in which that information is used at leadership is very, very different. The board need information for a specific purpose. They don't just want general information that's not useful to them, okay? So the information that's given should be simple and focused on the real question and issue. So if the board members are looking at perhaps diversity and equality in terms of, you know, the makeup of their staff, then information on what shoe size they are is not important, because they're not really caring about different size of feet. So it's about making sure that information that they've gathered is relevant, okay? They perhaps care about the ethnicity, they perhaps care about, you know, the sexual orientation of the workforce, they perhaps care about things like the social background. So, you know, again, are we exclusively looking at, you know, higher upper class society members in our organization, or do we have people that are more reflective of society? So again, these are the information set that they need. They don't need everything. Generates mines the board value. So again, the quality of that information, the quality and timeliness of that information is what makes sure that the discussion that's had is A, fully informed, and B, relevant. Because if you're going to give the board information from the organization that's 4 or 5 years old, then really they're making decisions based on something that's already happened, probably already changed. You know, the structural makeup of your organization 4 years ago is very, very different to what it is today. The performance of your organization 4 years ago would be completely outdated. So again, ensuring that the information is timely, but also full of quality information is important. And finally, it bridges the management action and the board requirements. So remember what we said earlier, the role of management is to essentially the role of management is to implement what leadership want, okay? So management are there to implement those controls, those policies, those procedures that people should be observing. You know, what are the strategies, what are the objectives we're looking to achieve, how are we going to do that? It's a role of management to make sure that they turn that strategy set by leadership into tangible goals for people to work towards. So in doing that, they're able to then get information, they're able to gather performance metrics, they're able to gather employee feedback, they're able to gather, you know, their observations and share that with the strategic leadership board. Okay, so basically it's the quality of that information that unites or bridges the action taken by management and the requirements set by the strategic leadership board. Board decisions, now this can be quite critical, okay? So well-informed and high-quality decisions making is a critical requirement for any board to be effective, and that doesn't happen by accident, okay? So it can be difficult sometimes, like the cartoon demonstrates. Now everybody is saying yes or they're saying aye to agree with the perspective, but the speech bubbles show what they're actually thinking. So nobody in this boardroom seems to agree with what's going on, but they're saying yes because everyone else is saying yes, or they're saying yes because they don't want to be seen as being negative or being, off-putting towards a certain policy or a certain procedure. So again, it's about ensuring that when you are making decisions, you are holding each other accountable, you are challenging the thinking, because you might not be the only one that thinks something isn't right. But if no one else is speaking out, you might feel that, okay, maybe I shouldn't speak out either. And that can be detrimental to an organization. Flawed decisions can be made with the best of intentions, with competent individuals believing passionately that they're making a sound judgment when they might in actual fact not be, because maybe no one challenged thinking, maybe the information was incomplete, maybe they were misinformed. So it's all about making sure that you are challenging the thinking. In a board, what you say or don't say has an impact on the final decision and ultimately the quality of direction given for the mission accomplishment and the objectives that the organisation is looking to achieve. Now, the irony of leadership is that people don't actually equip you with the knowledge to make right decisions, and that applies anywhere in society, in an organisation, anywhere at all, really. No one gives you the tools. You know, no one actually equips you with the knowledge on how to make right decisions. They give you information, they give you research, they give you insights, but how you use and interpret them is completely down to you. And yet they expect you to make great decisions and think you're an imbecile if you don't. So again, people make mistakes, things do go wrong, And, leadership is perhaps open to more scrutiny because they're always expected to get it right. They're expected to do the right thing. So it can be difficult for a leader in that position when they are trying to make a decision where, it can be quite difficult to see what is the right path. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that is taking place. Now that's quite interesting, and that's something I'm not sure if anyone's ever experienced themselves. I know I have. Sometimes you leave a meeting and you think to yourself, well, we talked a lot. We spent an hour talking, but did we actually communicate anything that actually addressed what we wanted to address? Do you leave that meeting feeling that you are more informed, more aware, you know what you're doing, or do you leave that meeting with, okay, we talked about it, but I still don't really see, how that's going to change what we're doing, how that's going to impact how we achieve that result. So the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that we have talked about it, but just talking about it is not enough. Did we actually come up with something tangible from that meeting? And that's quite key to making sure that your commitment and your achievement in that capacity isn't diminished. So a couple of examples of those situations. Well, ambition versus capacity. One of the dangers that often faced by a board of directors or an executive leadership team is trying to do too much with too little information. Okay, so again, it's about that quality and timeliness of information, not just for management. Sometimes it comes down to research and stuff that the organization needs to look external for, but not having enough information and trying to do too much with it, or not having the right information to make that decision can be quite a difficult challenge. And sometimes it comes down to how ambitious the organization is versus what capacity that organization has to be able to achieve those goals and objectives. So that's something to bear in mind in your discussion when you're thinking about, okay, so how do you kind of set up your organization for optimal performance, for ensuring that you're creating a sustainable organization? Think about the role of ambition and how that compares to the capacity that exists in the structural makeup of the firm. Finally, board members' behaviour. So this is quite critical because it's all about thinking how people behave in that boardroom. So this guy is saying we need more dissenting opinions. So dissenting opinions means, we need people to stand up and talk against or challenge what we're saying. We need people to, not just be yes men. We need people to actually think about what's being discussed here, and we need people to challenge our thinking. And if you look at the caricature, everyone's saying, we agree 100%, absolutely. So again, the perspective I'm trying to make with this caricature is having people that agree with everything you're saying can actually be a negative outcome. You don't necessarily want everyone to agree. You want someone to challenge. You want someone to hold you accountable, because by doing that, you're making a fully informed decision. Okay, so my perspective, if we were to create a board of us on the call today, what I'm saying may or may not be correct. I mean, I've only read certain things. I've only looked at certain publications. I've only looked at certain elements. I've not read everything in the leadership literature. I've not read everything that exists on strategic leadership. But if everyone just says they agree with me, does that mean that I'm right? Or does it mean that perhaps maybe I'm not being held accountable for what I know or don't know, as the case may be? Okay, so that's something to bear in mind when we talk about board members' behaviour. So bring it all together, ladies and gentlemen, thinking about governance performance versus organisational performance, there's a strong consensus that you can't really separate the two, okay? Inefficiencies grow out of inadequate board governance. So inefficiencies exist with inadequate board governance. Now, what do you mean by inadequate board of governance? It basically is where it creates the conditions that lead to mismanagement of maybe company funds. It leads to misinformation, it leads to miscommunication that can result in poor organizational performance. So some of those perspectives that we just discussed over the last 7 or 8 slides talk about what governance procedures should be in an executive leadership function, what the board members' role should be, what quality of information they need access to, how they should hold each other accountable and challenge one another. These are all corporate governance perspectives that are quite important to ensure that organizational performance doesn't suffer. Therefore, the issue is not whether good governance is a linchpin to organizational success, but more how to get board members to govern institutional performance. Okay, so how do you get board members to govern in such a way that we can achieve institutional performance? And that's a challenge that even today we don't necessarily have the right answer to. Okay, even if you can read up as many academic textbooks, journals, articles as you want, the answer is still the same. We don't necessarily know how to do that universally. People have done studies into different types of organizations. People have done studies into different board compositions and try to understand, how does the board effectively deliver organizational performance that's sustainable? But there is no one answer that's universally applicable. There are a number of different perspectives, and we've shared some of them with you today. We've talked about some of the strategies that should be used to overcome some of the issues with corporate governance, but there is no one best approach. It's about the combination of all of these and ensuring that the conversation that's being had at executive leadership level is such that it can achieve success. Okay. And that really brings to a conclusion our module on strategic leadership. So if we reflect on what we've done so far with the module, we touched on defining leadership and looking at what leadership wasn't, because that's one of the easiest ways to define it. If you remember, we compare leadership to management, discussed the difference of how we observe leadership compared to management. We looked at sources of leadership, where they can come from, although our focus was always executive because we're looking at strategic leadership, but we looked at different places that leadership can resonate or can be born from. We then started looking at characteristics and traits. Now, a lot of the literature talks about the theories, the different behaviours that leaders should demonstrate, the different characteristics. So I've given you a lot of different perspectives from academia. It's now about applying examples. So if you think about what we did with the very first lecture, we looked at different leadership examples. You looked at, people like Barack Obama, you looked at people like Donald Trump, you looked at Bill Gates, you looked at Steve Jobs. These are all examples of senior leaders in different capacities and different positions, and thinking about, what leadership characteristics and traits they perform. And then today we took it further. We've taken it forward to understand the role of corporate governance, particularly from executive pay perspective, but then we looked at power, and finally we looked at how corporate governance at a leadership position can influence success in the future as well. Okay. Quick question that's come through from Tina. Tina, yes, the recordings from each lecture that we do, so weeks 1, 2, and today, week 3, they're all shared with Abhishek Chowdhury. Now, I'm not sure what he does with it. He's responsible for putting it all on the system. So if you haven't got access, or you don't know where to access it, I would recommend emailing Abhishek. It's abhishek@lsbr.uk. That's who you need to contact to get access to the recording. Okay. No problem at all. You're welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, any questions? We've only got a couple of minutes left. Anything anyone wants to ask based on a lecture series, based on what we've covered? Any questions anyone has that they want to bring up? No? Very quiet today, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, a couple of things coming through now. Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, really enjoyed the sessions. Very great insights at board level and in terms of leading our team. So very, very great. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. You're more than welcome. Hopefully it helped. Improve your understanding of how leadership plays a fundamental role, not only in managing performance or directing performance today. It's also about thinking into the future, because at the end of the day, the role of leadership today isn't just about the here and now, it's about preparing the organization for the future. So corporate governance is quite an interesting perspective. So I certainly would recommend, if anyone's starting to look into leadership functions as part of their assignment, think about their role in terms of managing or leading performance in the future. So sustainable performance is quite a key thing in literature, but it's also quite a key thing in practice today. Today, we're looking at how leadership will be viewed in the future, not just how they'll be viewed today. Great. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? No, everyone seems to be happy. Well, thank you very much for all the nice messages in the chat. It's great to hear that you enjoyed today's session. The recording, as always, will be sent to Abhishek. I've shared his email in the chat, so if you need to get in touch with him, please do drop him an email. Otherwise, thank you very much for all your attention, and I wish you the best of luck with your assignment as well. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye for now.